And James literally said what he said, and words have meaning. Now, what I do find in common with all the people who want to leap to the defense of James 2, even the ones who say they're grace, is that they don't seem to care about the precision of the word. They allegorize left and right. And yet, when we look at it and we say, what we want you to do is read the plain text of James 2. Don't interpret, don't allegorize. What is he saying? And then we want you to read the plain text of Paul's own testimony from Galatians 1 and 2, where, the doctrine that shook the continent of Europe and broke off the chains of the Roman Empire was the book of Galatians. And you know what that book comes out of? All the doctrine in that book comes out of a rebuke. It's an anecdotal account of a rebuke to Peter, who acted like a hypocrite and pretended like he wasn't eating with the Gentiles and broadcast that he was under law for fear of men from James. Okay? And that was what led to the Acts 15 council. So we want you to read Paul's own testimony from Galatians 1 and 2, where he clearly says he did not bring his doctrine to Jerusalem. He didn't even have a chance to until the Acts 15 conference. He hadn't met any of them. They did not have his insight. And then we want you to read the plain text of Acts chapter 1 through 15, and you tell me what they believed in Jerusalem. And then go back and read James 2, and realize that it was written prior to Acts 15. This is not super hard. And then what do they say? You're twisting the word. You're just pulling a narrative out of your... Somebody said, you're just talking out of your ass. You're a heretic, Bible denier. It's absolutely ridiculous. The accusations thrown at us, while people refuse to look at the literal plain text words on the page that James 2 says, recognize the significance that it was written before Acts 15, which means he did not have the benefit of Paul's insight, refuse to acknowledge what the story in Acts tells us about what they believed in Jerusalem, which is that Jews are under law, Gentiles have to be proselytes to Jews. And then refuse to acknowledge what Paul said in Galatians that led to the doctrine of, I through the law died to the law. I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of Christ, if righteousness came through the law, Christ died in vain. That was actually in the quote of his anecdotal account of his rebuke to Peter in front of everybody. And that all was stimulated from the fact that Peter was afraid of men from James because the last time he'd been in Jerusalem, he was persecuted for eating with Gentiles when he went to Cornelius' house in Acts 10. And the Holy Ghost fell, and he stayed there for a couple days. When he came back, there were two things that they said. So Gentiles can be saved, which was a surprise to them, number one. And number two, they persecuted him for eating with Gentiles. And we know that persecution must have been very strong, because by the time the brothers, or the men, came from James to Antioch, months or maybe a year later, he's still so afraid of him that he literally gets up from the table and pretends like he's not been eating with Gentiles, because in his mind, we're still under law and he's not clear. So Paul says for the first time, we died to the law and we were crucified with Christ. Now that's what he's been teaching, but they don't understand that in Jerusalem. That's why Galatians was written, and that's why Hebrews was written. And in Paul's doctrine, in his gospel, which is Romans, he addresses the question, when was Abraham justified? Now, who's he asking that to? Why is he establishing the timing? Because what had been circulating was everybody thought Abraham was justified by works, and they were tying it to big acts that he did, including Mount Moriah. Where did they get that? From Jerusalem. That was what they were teaching. James is a reflection of what they were teaching in Jerusalem.